All right, folks, on to our second mini lecture where we'll cover more modern geography, the emergence of modern geography from about the late 18th century, that is the second half of the 1700s, through to the 1920s or so. And we'll focus our discussion on major thinkers of the time who advanced ideas of what geography is and should be. And recall that in our discussion of classical geography, we raised a number of key themes, including the tension within geography as a discipline between focusing on general questions of measurement, distance, mapping, and specific descriptions of particular places. Okay, we'll see that continue to emerge. We'll also see more prominently discussions of how to think about the relationship between humans and the environment. That's something that has been within geography as a focus forever. We didn't really cover it in our discussion of classical geography. It was there, and your text goes into it in a bit more detail, but we'll really get into it in this mini lecture because, as we'll see, it was one of the defining questions of that time period. So we'll start here with Immanuel Kant, who we could say ushered in the modern period in philosophy in general. He's more well known as a philosopher, one of the most prominent of his time and one of the most prominent ever in Western philosophy. And in many ways, he was a geographer. He taught geography. He defined it in terms of physical geography and other geography. And we might read that as a slight, especially the human and cultural geographers amongst us, but in that other category were political geography and all sorts of more human geography kinds of topics. Okay, he saw geography as an explanatory science with predictive potential. This is another key tension within geography that has been present forever within the discipline. Mostly what we see in classical, medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment geography is geography as something that describes places. We saw that with Vrenius in the 1600s, just in the last mini lecture. Geography is something that can describe the many places of the world or describe where things are on the surface of the earth. Okay, but for Kant, geography is an explanatory science that can predict based on the explanations that it comes up with for why things are where they are on the surface of the earth. Okay, and that will continue to be an important theme as we progress through the history of the discipline. Now, your textbook gets into some of the debates around whether Kant is really responsible for pushing forward this notion of absolute space. Absolute space, or its similarities in Cartesian coordinates or Newtonian definitions of geometry, really refers to the idea that space pre-exists. Okay, so think back to Plato's definition of kanon. Okay, space is something that pre-exists, it's the void, it's something we can map out in terms of x and y coordinates, it can be gridded on a Cartesian grid like that. Okay, it's Newtonian geometry in terms of basic measurements. Okay, that's absolute space. Space as always having existed like that. And that differs from what we will come to call relative or even relational notions of space that were started to, became more in force from the philosophy of Leibniz at this time. Okay, another important prominent philosopher. And relative notions of space describe space as a process that does not pre-exist, but that comes into being. That is to say that, there aren't just sort of things out there that take up space that, exist in absolute terms like this. But in fact, space is what we make it, okay? And, it could be said that Kant really reinforced the notion of space as absolute, okay? But this debate or discussion or this this tension is really something that we will continue to explore in contemporary geography. At the end of the day, bottom line is that Kant saw space and time as fundamental categories through which we perceive the world. Perception is really important to Kant. So Kant was a German or Prussian geographer, and a lot of the geographers we'll see during this time period are also German geographers. So von Humboldt really was an important figure in geography in the earlier first half of the 1800s. Okay, von Humboldt was a natural scientist who did empirical field work around the world. Okay, so kind of the stereotypical sort of macho geographer, traveling everywhere, doing field work, categorizing things, collecting data, okay, seeing the world in order to describe it and develop theory from it, okay. So he really put the emphasis on field work within geography, okay. Geographers of all stripes do field work these days, whether it's going out and doing interviews with people in different places, or of course in physical geography, going out and collecting data from forests, and rivers and whatnot. So he, maybe unlike some of the geographers we've seen previously, really was focused on the human environment relationship. He traveled around the world, did most notably travels to South America to focus on how people use the environment around them to grow crops. He could be said to be a systematic geographer, by which we just mean he attempted to bring together the general and the specific, okay? So we've by now really emphasized this tension or dilemma at the heart of geography between how can we be general about measurements and distances and things that can apply everywhere on the planet, as well as just describing specific or particular places. He sought to more systematically approach that question by bringing the two together. He was also a proponent of geography as something that can predict and explain. So one of his most well-known theories that sought to predict and explain was the theory of how latitudinal position relates to the development of civilizations, right? So trying to look at the important civilizations throughout time and sort of seeing how they fall within around the 40th latitude, okay? That can ultimately be driven back to some of the theories developed by von Humboldt. Karl Ritter, another German geographer at this time, also sought explanation of human systems via the physical environment. So just like von Humboldt sought to understand the rise of important civilizations over time as a product of physical environment, and in particular latitude, and the climates that form around different latitudes, Ritter was also interested in how human systems are shaped by the physical environment. Okay, he could be said to be the first regional geographer in name, although regions, of course, as we see them, have a long history within the discipline, back to the Greeks. He saw the world as one unified entity, but differentiated into regions like Western Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, these big regions that we could or that he could come up with that were different from one another, but that themselves were unified on the basis of physical characteristics, ecological characteristics, and cultural characteristics. Okay, so he sought to emphasize unity within differentiated parts. Whereas geographers today, contemporary geography, might emphasize differences more than any sort of unity, okay? That's another key dimension or debate within the discipline. And he was the author of a big book, Urkund, that actually took him nearly 50 years to write, a little over 40 years to write. At this time, remember that one of the key things we're exploring this week is the relationship between the production of geographic knowledge and context, politics of the time, economics of the time, so on and so forth. We saw that we've seen this throughout, okay? An example being with the Enlightenment and folks like Varenius in the 1600s developing geographic theory. Well, in part, they were able to do that because the role of commerce and trade with the new so-called New World and Europe expanding at that time diminished the power of the church and allowed more power to be vested in geographers making maps of the so-called New World, okay, and gave more prominence to those kinds of researchers, okay. The same is true of the 1800s, where imperialism from Western powers towards places like Africa, South Asia, was at its height. And that gave room for researchers, geographers, such as Halford Mackinder, a British geographer, writing at about the turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries. And his goal was to understand how the different nations and regions of the world interrelated as elements in holistic geopolitical structure. So again, this idea that, there's an overall structure or unity in the world, but that there are differences between places that we have to understand the interactions between. And he was specifically interested in this in terms of politics and militaries and the relations between different powers, okay? And unlike maybe someone like von Humboldt, who's out categorizing new plants and landforms and so on, Mackinder was fine to just sit at home in his armchair and think theoretically, not really empirically, okay? So looking at a map and sort of theorizing, well, what does this mean in terms of world history? And he was doing so at the height of the British Empire, trying to understand how the empire could expand, how it expanded so far, and maybe some threats from other places. So two were geographers outside of England, including Frederick Ratzel, a German geographer influenced by Darwin and theories of evolution that emerged in the 19th century. That's a key component of your textbook, that discussion of Lamarck and Darwin. And it's important for the conversations geographers have had and did have at this time around human-environment relationships. Okay, so theory of evolution posits that obviously over time, organisms adapt to their surroundings, whether it's willfully, like Lamarck says, or through selection, as Darwin says. And this really shaped geographers' thinking about how environments work and how humans relate to environment. So some geographers took Darwin's ideas and applied them to human systems, to think about how humans and human societies evolve over time in relation to their environment. So Ratzel, in particular, came up with the notion of Lebensraum, so that the struggle for survival in Darwin becomes not just struggle survival amongst organisms like tortoises and birds and whatever, but humans. Okay, so humans are seen by Ratzel to struggle for space. Different groups of humans struggle for space. And this is most notoriously known as the theory by which the Nazis justified a lot of their activities. Okay, so a lot of unsavory thinking done in geography over time, and including the work of Ratzel, who maybe would have disagreed with what the Nazis did. He didn't live at that time. But still, a lot of ideas that geographers have produced have lent themselves to the service of nefarious forces. On the other hand, geographers like Kropotkin and Reclus, anarchist geographers, very differently saw the relationship between humans and the environment. So Kropotkin came up with the notion, took Darwin's ideas about evolution and said, well, it's not so much a struggle that organisms, an individual struggle that organisms go through, but actually there's lots of cooperation that we can see in the natural world and in the human world, so that it's not so much a struggle as much as a mutual aid kind of process where groups of humans work together to make life out of the natural world, and indeed maybe even organisms themselves do this in many different ways. Reclus, more broadly, saw geography not as a tool of the state, okay, as Mackinder tried to employ it, and many geographers before him, like Strabo, but as something that could counteract the power of the state. So geography could document all the different kinds of communities that self-organized around the world, okay? And he was really interested in the natural makeup of a region and how it influences human life and society in that region, producing distinctive, bounded regional cultures visible in the landscape. And indeed, this question of human-environment relationships was perhaps the key problem at the heart of geography at this time, as your text makes clear. And by the early part of the 20th century, it had morphed into a theory called environmental determinism, where the predominant perspective on human-environment relationships was the following, was the idea that the environment determined the composition of societies and even individual people and cultures, okay? So this was influenced by German geography, and in particular Ratzel, and put forward by key thinkers such as Ellen Churchill Semple, an American geographer. She posited that the physical environment presents largely unsurpassable limits on human development. Famously, she said, man, by which she meant humankind, is the product of the Earth's surface. Okay, so a really kind of reductionist view on, well, how is it that cultures and civilizations and societies come to be? Well, it's a product of mountains, forests, the rivers by which they gain sustenance, okay? And, you know, this matched some key political and cultural attitudes of the time, like colonialism, okay? Really justified attitudes that blamed the poorer parts of the world or the more underdeveloped parts of the world for their conditions, while conveniently ignoring the brutality of colonialism. But it was meant to, you know, a lot of people sort of read environmental determinism as a racist sort of theory in terms of, well, you know, Africa is poor because it's tropical and, you know, it's hot and whatever. And in many ways, that is a kind of racist theory. But it's important to note that environmental determinists like Semple at the time didn't see themselves as racist. And in fact, they were trying to come up with explanations for why different societies exist on this planet in ways that actually moved away from explanations based on race. So instead of positing that, well, it's simply the color of one's skin that determines the the sort of quality of a society, very racist idea, they said, well, it's not so much obviously race and biology and hereditariness, it's actually environment. Result is the same. They came up with something that was frankly pretty racist, but they were trying to move away from biology itself as the determining explanatory factor. So here's an example of Semple's work. Great examples in your textbook. This is just one that sort of says, well, you know, people who live in mountains are underdeveloped because mountains make it hard to develop, you know, big cities, and it makes it hard for people to think clearly, and, you know, all sorts of just really speculative links between landform and societal factors. Okay. This is not something, environmental determinism is not something that is a relic of the past, though. In many ways, it lives on. This is one of the most popular geographic texts of the past 20 years, something that reinforced my interest in geography, guns, germs, and steel, something that many of you may have read and gotten into. Maybe this led you into geography. And in many ways, it is a kind of environmental determinist approach, okay, to say that the rise and fall of civilizations has a lot to do with the shape of the continents, okay, in terms of how societies were able to trade with one another across different latitudes or across different longitudes, which is what Diamond posits in his book. In many ways, that is an environmental determinist read that misses a lot of factors. And we'll see some of responses to environmental determinism in our next few lectures in coming weeks. So to sum it up, what we see in the period of the 1800s and the early 1900s is some pretty discomforting threads of geographic thought, reinforcing and lending themselves to imperialism and colonialism, okay, through mapping of different places and justifying exploration and conquering, justifying or lending support to the notion that indigenous peoples under or misuse resources and calling to assimilate those peoples to lead more productive, quote unquote, productive and modern lives. We also see environmental determinism theories that posit that environment determines culture and social traits as opposed to economic or political factors like imperialism and colonialism, okay? As well as social Darwinism, okay, that posited a preordained natural social order, okay. We also see some responses to this already in the terms of anarchist geographies, but these were the predominant threads in geographic thought at the time. To recap, across several thousand years of geographic history, we see some key themes. So geographers have long described places and cultures, but they've also tried to explain and predict physical and social phenomena. They've emphasized human-environment relations, tried to understand how one determines the other. Spatial relationships have been key to geographers, especially in trying to understand geopolitics. These all remain prevalent discussions within various fields and institutions of geography. And that's where we'll pick up next time when we actually look at geography as a discipline today and dig into a bit more of the philosophy of science within our discipline.